Do you know, like in some countries, I know in Canada, that once a murder goes past, say, 5 years unsolved, it becomes a cold case immediately. It's hard to believe that Fat Andy Connors is 10 years dead. And the case just seems to have gone completely cold. You never hear much about it. There was only ever, from my memory, one arrest. And that was an individual who was questioned, who was a sort of a known member of the INLA, who was at that time sort of living down the road from Fat Andy's homestead in around some lands owned by the Mansfields, which of course surround Fat Andy's complex there in Saggart. But remind us what happened. And I suppose, first of all, who he was.
In, when was it? August the 19th, 2014, Fat Andy was shot dead in his house, the ranch, which was the old animal pound for a part of Dublin Council at the time. And he was hit at least 6 times with a gun. I think it was suggested by one of his kids at his inquest that it was a Makarov type pistol. And it was a balaclava gunman wearing a bulletproof vest, black balaclava, black gloves. He walked in. He pushed this daughter out of the way, pushed her to the ground. He had a gun in his right hand, and he put 6 to 7 bullets into Andy Connors in his house. He pretty much died at the scene. He's been cradled by his wife, Anne. This was all mentioned. Mm-hmm. At the inquest in 2017, one of the daughters talks about describing what she thought was the machine gun. He shot my daddy 6 or 7 times. He fell backwards onto my mammy, and the man walked out. Just the idea of him walking out calmly, getting into a car and driving away. It was somebody who kind of was confident of their ground, what they were doing. Obviously felt that there was no danger to them. There wasn't any bodyguards or anything like that. He was a soft target, really. I mean, he was I suppose, a notorious criminal that we never really got to write about while he was alive, because it was only ever kind of small enough stuff that he was done for, like burglaries, this type of thing. I think he had about 19 convictions. But the real depth of his criminality hadn't come out, despite, a couple of times when he was attracted the attention at cab. But like his whole role as, I suppose, the key player in what we now know as a transnational criminal gang and underworld banker was unknown to us at that stage. And this, we've been able to kind of write about this since in those 10 years. And the fact is that the organised crime gang that he belongs to is still going.
And like, in a way, they feel like they were different times back then in 2014. And we'll talk a little bit about what Fat Andy Connors was at the time and what was going on around him. But he felt comfortable there in that home, in the ranch, a place where I've been. And in the aftermath of this, a number of times I've spoken to the family up there at the house, and there was little security. You could drive in, you still probably can. It's an expansive property that backs on to Coldwater Lakes Estate. There is a site beside it that really was possibly at the heart of some tensions that the Connors family were having with the Mansfield family at the time. I think that Anne Connors, in the aftermath of her husband's death, suggested that the Mansfields owed her money, that he had invested some money with them and that he hadn't been paid back. And there was suggestions, and certainly it looked as if she was sort of trying to move on to some land beside the property, perhaps as, the debt payback, land which was registered to Boher Boy, which was one of the Mansfield companies. But there was sort of, there was trouble there. There was a little bit of kind of, financial wranglings. And of course, at that time, we wouldn't have been able to write much about the Mansfields either, or their financial situation. Of course, all of that has been placed before the courts now. The fact that the Mansfields, Jim Mansfield Sr. was laundering money really for criminal organisations. And as he became sick and as his empire went into receivership, his son was left with the problems, which were how to pay back those dirty money investors and keep the wolves from the door. And of course, he had a series of paramilitary groupings in his property, protecting him from the likes of Fat Andy Connors, who it was claimed was kind of putting pressure on him for his money back.
Yeah, and that was one of the theories at the time. And there was, as well, I suppose, a cash sum of 300,000 at one point that I think some of the INLA figures were specifically, interested in that. They felt it belonged to them, and there was, I think, kind of an internal row over whose cash it was and where it was and who had taken it. And even people I spoke to at the time of his murder, they were saying, a lot of people have lost their money now because it's gone with with Andy Connors, like, because they would have given him money to invest or to, and again, they would have owed money as well to him. And so there's a mixture of things. So some people, their debt died with him, and in others, their buried treasure was gone as well, or their share of it. So I mean, there was a quite a mix. Like, it was unexpected. I don't think, like, he certainly didn't think he was a target at that time. He'd been out for a couple of pints, I think, with a neighbour, and I think the night before had been at a wedding in Kildare of a young couple who would have been delighted to have him, because, I mean, like,
he was a star.
Oh, yeah, exactly. We're talking about him, being the head of an organised crime gang involved in really nasty crime, and who were incredibly reckless and, and violated people's homes. But, like, to his own family and to people, and to kind of people in that milieu, saw him as a generous character, affable, approachable. That he wasn't a nasty guy, that he turned up and would be generous, like, I know, at a wedding of a young couple, in terms of buying drinks or presents and that sort of thing, would be quite willing to flash the cash and, act a big man, but in a nice way.
And he was flash.
He certainly was flash, and death as well as life.
Exactly. But, like, I mean, let's talk about life, because of course there was a 2.5 million euro sort of revenue bill that there was a Criminal Assets Bureau investigation into Connors and his property. I think there was 9 properties in total identified, or thereabouts. The Criminal Assets Bureau can take a proceeds of crime case, or they can take a revenue case. And when they took the case against Connors, it was a revenue one. A bit more complex, but basically there's this tax bill. So then the Criminal Assets Bureau get a lien as such on the mortgages of all these properties. So if you ever try to sell them, they get paid back first. Is that
generally, yeah, that's the way it works. Yeah. Once you have a lien on it, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
they don't tend to use a huge amount of them, though, those revenue cases anymore. They tend to go for proceeds of crime.
Yeah, it seems to be the easier way, because that means they can seize it. Like, they used to have to wait up to 7 years. That's going to be changed in legislation shortly. I mean, although in one case they were kind of willing to push it out to 9 years because they can delay making the order, and then the 7 years kick in and all the rest of it. But I think that was when the legislation came in first, and there was a real reluctance to, give the state any power to seize private property. Kind of, you want to see where the ball is going to land and see how the legislation works out before any kind of more draconian legislation is brought in. So it looks like we're going to be getting to that at some point. I mean, there's no reason why they can't go back at Ann Connors or any member of the family with some of these
start again
with these properties, and certainly if anything has been acquired,
are they waiting on the banks? Because I know in another case that I was covering, and I won't name the individual because I must go back and just see where that's at now, but it was a significant criminal figure. And they had taken this revenue case, and I remember making inquiries because he just remained living in this house, just kept on living in it. And I mean, years went by and he was still there. And I was told at that stage that they were sort of waiting on the banks to move on the property before they could get their payment and their judgment on the mortgages. So it just it makes it more complex. But that Criminal Assets Bureau case against Connors was huge publicity around it at the time, because didn't he have a second house up the road?
That was, the first one, the Villa.
The Villa.
Yeah, on the Blessington Road, and put it up for sale for 3 million. I think the tax demand was like 260,000 or something. Right. It wasn't a whole lot. Obviously, he settled it, and the villa was never sold. So still part of, I imagine, Ann Connors' possessions at this stage.
And this villa was a huge, big property with, pillars at the front of it. And I think there was some sort of was there a swimming pool maybe somewhere in it, or there was something like that. There was something really snazzy in it. It'd be either a tennis court or a swimming pool. And no one ever lived in it.
Yeah.
It was all done up, and there was
furniture,
a caravan out the back.
Yeah. And he lived out the back.
Yeah.
And people would rent space there as well. They'd come and go, use that as a handy spot on their holidays or moving about. They pay rent to move into the back of the villa.
So all the while he was sort of collecting this property portfolio, he was heading up a burglary gang, plus operating as a banker?
I mean, just in terms of the burglary stuff, like his father was Pale Michael Miley Connors, kind of an absolutely notorious housebreaker. He passed away in 2016, I suppose, 2 years after his son. But he was still picking up convictions in 2013 at the age of 74. So, it's, and we mentioned this before, and even Andy Connors, I think, was caught at a point where I think he had possession of a screwdriver driving in somewhere in South County Dublin.
That was the wife, Anne Connors.
And so I mean, it's a lifestyle, it's a hobby. It's like some people, play golf or play rugby or whatever they do in their life, go show jumping. But for him, it was to do a bit of the old house creeping or breaking.
And was it creeper burglaries?
Oh, all the time, yeah. I mean, look, we know their modus operandi. Like, it's all the various members of the gang. It's prolific. It's quick. It's in and out, and it's not necessarily creeper burglaries. They'll kick in a door of a house if they know it's empty, or they'll if they can, they'll get in any way they can. They'll jimmy the windows open, and usually if they're confronted by somebody, they'll run away straight away. They don't want to get into that situation because I suppose they don't know what they're going to meet. But I guess it's a more serious charge if it's an aggravated burglary. But I suppose the way it works is they just do so many of these break-ins. They'll do 5 or 6 in a week, or even 5 or 6 in a night. I mean, they would have been the original Subaru gang, the Gypsy gang, the cigarette gang, whatever they were called, when they used to do they steal the high-powered cars and break into filling stations across provincial Ireland, all from West Talla, head out to wherever. I mean, they literally covered the 26 counties and very much kind of hurried up the Department of Justice to supply a helicopter to the guards. It was the only way they could stop them, because they were just so reckless in the way they carried it out and made their money just by the sheer speed and recklessness. I think at one point, like, his gang there was a definitive link between burglaries that would have taken something like €11 million worth of property. So these are kind of supposedly small-time car thieves breaking into shops and stealing cigarettes, yet it turns into 11 million over a couple of years. So it's significant. And then when you're investing that money into property in South Dublin, into Southwest Dublin, it's going to turn into multiples of that. So he became quite wealthy. And
became certainly somebody who was knocking round with Jim Mansfield Sr. and later his son, Jim Jr. I think a guy that was, affable and quite well liked as well, despite what he was doing.
Yeah, it's able to get on with people, he
from all walks of life.
Yeah, and so I mean that always helps in any business, whether you're a journalist with a plausible manner or whether you're not. Depends, like, how easy you'll find your career. But yeah, look, I mean, he was able to get on, and I suppose, like, the more serious work, I guess, as opposed to the hobby break-ins, were left to the younger members. And we've, like, since seen them, like, we talked about that the gang who went viral, William Connors, who's a close relative of his. I'm not sure whether he's a brother or a cousin, but right. he's a close relative of Fat Andy, and he was the man in probably similar age to what Fat Andy would be now, and he was driving the Audi Q5 that went through the roundabout in Lidl outside of Nace after a huge guard operation. You all saw the video of the car upside down and the 5 guys bloodied and bandaged sitting on the ground, handcuffed, and one of those is in custody in Australia at the minute on suspected charges of the same thing. His own son, John Connors, or Jonathan Sluicy, as he's known in the UK as well, he's serving time. He's doing 3 years at
Andy Connors' son.
His son, yeah. And he's still wanted in the UK. He featured on Crime Watch, where him and another guy called Michael Nerney, who's also been arrested in Australia, and they were planting trackers on restaurant owners' cars so they could break in when the guys were back at work, assuming that these people weren't declaring their cash business to revenue and stealing that money. So I mean, they have it well organised what they do. I mean, even that Audi that they use had been stolen in London, was connected to 17 burglaries in Northern Ireland before the whole pursuit and the famous crash then in Nace. So this is their
family business, basically.
Yeah.
When Andy Connors died, you could see how loved he was by his family. They have been very vocal, very out there on social media. They haven't forgotten an anniversary. The funeral was a very big, I suppose we could say, flashy event. I think he was buried in a gold-plated coffin? And
yeah, and there's
Rolex on his arm.
We're getting various estimates on the price of the coffin, from 40 grand to 100 grand, and the Rolex been 40 grand. And a minimum of like, I think a statue close to 100 grand that was craned onto the grave a year later down in Gorey.
That's right.
And so, I mean, you're talking the best part of, I don't know, what, somewhere.
Would you call that a grave, or what would you call those things?
It's kind of like memorial, really, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's
it's absolutely enormous thing.
Yeah.
And of course, he's described on it, it's carved into the marble.
Yeah.
Big, fat, rich Andy Connors, yeah. I remember I was trying to work out, was it just big, rich Andy Connors, or did they call him big, fat as well? Fat Andy Connors, yeah. That was his nickname.
And it still appears on social media. Members of the family on occasions will go down and be dressed up for, whether it's the anniversary or whether it's somebody's wedding or whatever, they will go and pay tribute and pose for pictures at the grave as well. So, I mean, he's still much loved and missed and revered by his family.
And perhaps it's just their culture, but you don't see them ever coming out looking for information around his murder, or you don't see them it's probably not the thing to do to cooperate, I suppose, with the police, the law, which you'd have to do to kind of do a family appeal or anything like that. They're in a peculiar situation, I suppose, because a lot of them, including his wife, have convictions. They have this Criminal Assets Bureau judgment against them. They're obviously being described by media, etc., as an organised crime group, which they've long disputed, and his wife has long disputed that he'd anything to do with crime at all. But nonetheless, they're in a kind of a difficult position, I suppose, if you were wanting to look for help or for a push to have this murder solved.
Yeah, well, it's either two things. It's either they know exactly who did it and are frightened, or have decided to leave it alone, or they don't know who's after them and they're worried as well, which is, it's possible in, both options are viable, like in that sense. I mean, it was mentioned, like in terms of who did it, while nothing has really happened, there was the one arrest, and the file did go to the Director of Public Prosecutions, and so there's been no direction to go ahead with any case against this person who was arrested. But I think there was a detective inspector at the time of the inquest in 2017 said that they had 299 lines of inquiry they'd explored and taken 161 witness statements and just the one arrest. But it was a substantial investigation. I mean, by any standards, that's a fairly major investigation. But they haven't been able to crack it. So.
No, and it was after Fat Andy's death that, I think we reported ourselves that the gangland heavies, Troy Jordan and Martin the Viper Foley, went to represent Ann Connors with Jim Mansfield Jr. and her interests and her belief that her husband had died while Mansfield owed her a debt. And I'm just looking in 2021, in the February of that year, I actually did a story about how she had expanded out onto that Mansfield-owned field, which was beside the property. They had concreted it, and she had at that point placed a number of sort of mobile homes and was renting them out. She was sort of turning the lands and into a bit of a business for herself, but we haven't paid any much heed to them in a good while. So it might be interesting to see what's happening up at the ranch and if the Criminal Assets Bureau case is getting anywhere at all in relation to them. And more importantly, what will happen with the 10-year anniversary? Is there going to be any sort of appeal, or is it just going to be remembered here in Crime World?
Kind of sad, really, isn't it?
It is a bit.
If the only people who remember you are us two.
Us two, exactly. At least we're here. All right, Eamon, thank you.
Always a pleasure, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.